to stop secret trials in Canada, which has been fighting secret trial security certificates for over 17 years. We're gathering here today with a very simple question for the Prime Minister of Canada. Why are you trying to deport Mohamed Harkat, a refugee who has lived in this country peacefully for 22 years, to torture in Algeria? On October 26 of this year, Mr. Trudeau, you said the following: "I hope people remember to demand of governments, this one and all future governments, that nobody ever has their fundamental rights violated, either through inaction or deliberate action by Canadian governments. Nobody ever deserves to be tortured. And when a Canadian government is either complicit in that or was not active enough in preventing it, there needs to be a responsibility taken." Mr. Trudeau, we are calling on you to take that responsibility and end your government's efforts to deport Mohamed Harkat to torture. We are demanding, as you called us to do on October the 26th, that you stop violating Mohamed Harkat's fundamental rights. The basis for these efforts to torture Mr. Harkat are in a medieval star chamber process known as the secret trial security certificate, which unfortunately still exists and which still fails the test which was posed when it was first declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of Canada in 2007. How does one meet a case that one does not know because it's completely secret? Since International Human Rights Day in 2002, when he was arrested here in Ottawa without charge, without bail, and thrown into solitary confinement for over a year in conditions that were tantamount to torture, Mr. Harkat has never been allowed to see the substance of the case against him, even if a case exists. The whole basis of the alleged case rests on secret, hearsay allegations from an informant who failed a lie detector test and an informant who was carrying on an affair with a CSIS agent handler. It's also based on decades-old summaries of conversations, the original recordings and transcripts of which have been destroyed and whose accuracy and existence is impossible to verify. Mr. Trudeau, we trust that you are familiar with the techniques of psychological torture, also known as no-touch torture, that were perfected in Montreal at McGill University during the 1950s. Mr. Harkat is being subjected to just such a form of psychological torture now, because every moment of every day for the past 15 years, he has lived with the threat of being subjected to physical and psychological torture in Algeria if deported there. And so today we are demanding Prime Minister Trudeau and Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale, as you called on us to do, that you end this psychological torture, which consists of keeping Mr. Harkat in limbo, unable to move on with his life because he never knows when the shock of electric prods or the snap of the whip will be his daily reality. Such a decision to end these deportation to torture proceedings would be wholly consistent with England, where the Special Immigrations Appeals Commission settled this issue in 2016 when it ordered the government of Theresa May to stop sending Algerians to face torture in Algeria. And it would also be consistent with the Irish Supreme Court, which last July blocked the deportation of an Algerian refugee on similar grounds. In Mr. Harkat's case, your decision to try and deport him violates legally binding domestic criminal code laws against this, as well as international commitments under the Convention Against Torture. One of this country's leading mental health professionals recently produced a report based on over 100 interviews with Mr. Harkat and concluded thusly, quote, "It cannot be overemphasized how stressful Mr. Harkat's present situation is and how the present situation is anything but benign. Mr. Harkat has a history of chronic depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress related to having been incarcerated on a security certificate in maximum security for 43 months, including 1 year in solitary confinement, followed by many years of living under very strict bail conditions and facing deportation to Algeria, where he will be arrested, tortured, and at the risk of death. There are times when Mr. Harkat has experienced recurrent visions on a virtually daily basis over several months of being arrested, incarcerated, deported, and tortured. Often he has been troubled by insomnia and recurrent nightmares with the same themes as his daytime visions. This is a form of torture too. Mr. Trudeau, we don't want one of your successors to have to apologize for this ongoing human rights abuse years from now. The time to end it is now. We are demanding, once again, as you called us to do on October the 26th, to lift the deportation to torture and to end this cruel, inhumane proceeding against Mr. Harkat. Mr. Harkat currently has an application before the Public Safety Minister, Ralph Goodale, asking that he be given permanent resident status because it would not be contrary to Canada's national interest to have Moe stay in this country. Over 2,000 individuals have written support letters, and we're calling on Mr. Goodale to make the right decision as soon as possible. Allow Moe to stay in Canada and end your violation of the Convention Against Torture and the Criminal Code of Canada and these deportation to torture proceedings. I'm now going to introduce someone who's very familiar with this case and who deals with cases like these on a daily basis for many years.
I am Hilary Homes, the Program Manager with Amnesty International Canada. Human Rights Day really should be a day where we celebrate the promotion and protection of human rights. But for all of us standing up here, it's become a sad anniversary of a December 10th arrest that sent into motion a series of human rights violations, which you've just heard about. Every year, we truly hope it'll be the last time we're marking Human Rights Day this way. But here we are, 15 years later, with more and more uncertainty for Mohamed Harkat. While Amnesty International Canada continues to have serious concerns about the flawed nature of the security certificate process, I'm here today to talk about what might happen if that process, which is ultimately a deportation process, runs all the way to the end. Amnesty International is deeply concerned about the risk that Mohamed Harkat could face in his home country if he is deported to Algeria. Amnesty's research suggests that the forced return of Mr. Harkat to Algeria would put him at serious risk of being placed under incommunicado detention. That's a situation where an individual is denied access to family members, to an attorney or other legal advice, or an independent physician. Such a form of detention constitutes ill treatment and is contrary to international human rights law. Amnesty has documented numerous cases of individuals suspected of terrorism-related offenses being held by Algerian security forces in unrecognized places of detention and denied contact with the outside world, sometimes for prolonged periods of time. This treatment is in violation of Algeria's international human rights obligations, as well as the Algerian Code of Criminal Procedure. Detainees are most at risk of torture and ill treatment when held incommunicado by security forces, most notably the Department for Information and Security. That's the Algerian intelligence body responsible for detaining and interrogating persons suspected of involvement in terrorism-related activities. Amnesty has also found that the Algerian courts continue to accept confessions extracted under torture or duress, resulting in unfair trials. Effective safeguards against torture or other ill treatment in Algerian law and practice are sadly lacking, and security forces unfortunately continue to enjoy impunity for their acts of torture and other ill treatment of the individuals they detain. In addition to all of that, Amnesty is quite concerned about the use of what is known as diplomatic assurances as a means to arrange for the deportation of individuals to Algeria and other countries. Such assurances do not provide an effective safeguard against torture or other ill treatment. And when these assurances are from governments with a poor human rights record, such as Algeria, they are inherently unreliable. Given these serious concerns and the absolute nature of the principle of non-refoulement, Amnesty International has concluded that Mr. Harkat should not be returned to Algeria due to the risk of detention and ill treatment he would face there. This isn't the first time I've read out this risk assessment. It actually hasn't changed in years. It's well known to the Canadian government. It's long past time that for Canada to do the right thing. Canada must stop trying to deport Mohamed Harkat. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is McSorley. I'm the National Coordinator with the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. The ICLMG represents 45 organizations across Canada that fight for the protection of our rights in the context of national security laws and anti-terrorism laws. We were founded in 2002, the same year that Mohamed Harkat was taken under a security certificate, and every year since we were founded, we have had to stand up here and denounce the security certificate against Mohamed Harkat and the fact that he faces deportation or torture. We can't wait for the year when we don't have to stand up here and say this again and demand that a security certificate against Moe is released and lifted, and that he can live his life normally here in Canada without these fears. It's been 15 years that Mohamed Harkat has faced a security certificate, 15 years of not having access to the information used against him, 15 years of the threat of being deported to, as Hilary just mentioned, likely detention and torture. Our government has said they are fundamentally opposed to torture, but their actions continue to betray their words. Moe Harkat continues to face deportation to torture in Algeria, and if this government lived by the words, this would have ended long ago. This past fall, Canada announced new ministerial directions on information linked to torture. But these new regulations still do not draw a hard line against torture and still do nothing to ensure that people will be not deported to torture, as in the case of Mohamed Harkat. Currently, in Canada, we are debating the National Security Act, but none of the proposed changes in that proposed law will help people like Mohamed Harkat or others who face security certificates. Canada should never deport a person if there is a chance of torture. And that's precisely the danger that Mohamed Harkat continues to face today, along with others. We also have to highlight that today, in this age of extreme right-wing rallies across Canada and the United States, that these laws do nothing to stem the tide of Islamophobia and racism against Arabs and Muslims in Canada, and that these laws continue to target those communities and other racialized peoples. We can't ignore that that's a fact of these laws, and that there's a motivation behind these laws that is driven by racism and that is driven by targeting certain communities. These laws do not help to make us safer, and in fact they put more people in danger and serve to legitimize deportation to torture. The ICLMG and our 45 members stand in solidarity with Mohamed Harkat. Together we're calling on the government to end the security certificate regime and to end all deportation to torture. We don't want to be up here for another 15 years. Thank you.
Bonjour, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ihsaan Gardee, and I serve as Executive Director of the National Council of Canadian Muslims. The NCCM is a Muslim civil liberties and advocacy organization which has been active on the issue of security certificates for over a decade. The NCCM continues to have deep concerns about the security certificate process, which can lead to indefinite torture, indefinite detention, and the risk of deportation to torture. The NCCM intervened in Mr. Harkat's case at the Supreme Court of Canada, both in 2006 and in 2013. We argued that the security certificate process violates core civil liberties and fundamentally undermines Canada's tradition of treating all people equally. Although the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the security certificate system, it noted that it is an imperfect system. The NCCM maintains that the system is flawed, and Canada would be better served by a system whereby suspected individuals are able to see and fully respond to the evidence against them, as opposed to having things decided about them in a secret judicial process. This is especially concerning as the cost of a mistake is very high, including the risk of deportation to torture, which could violate Canada's international legal obligations. Canadian and international law expressly prohibit complicity of any kind in torture. Respected international human rights organizations such as Amnesty International have exposed Algeria's poor human rights record in this area. Just over 2 weeks ago, a story broke about 2 men detained in Algeria as a possible result of the sharing of information by Canadian security agencies with foreign agencies. One of the men also claims to have been tortured. Ultimately, there is a heavy personal price for security certificates, and it is not evident that Canada has gained any benefit from this process. Muslim communities are disproportionately harmed by security errors and abuses, as they are more likely to be wrongly suspected. This harm needs to be addressed through a more just legal process, and a much stronger, independent, and transparent oversight over the use of such powerful security measures. The NCCM calls on the federal government to consult with diverse Canadian communities, including Canadian Muslims, to ensure that Canada upholds justice and an accountable national security apparatus. Thank you.
Monia.
Good morning, bonjour. Je m'appelle Monia Mazigh et je suis auteure et militante pour les droits de la personne. 15 years ago, almost day for day, Mohamed Harkat was arrested under a security certificate. More specifically, it was on the International Human Rights Day. Since, his life has been horrible as hell. 3 years in prison in what we call Guantanamo North in Kingston in solitary confinement, then released under strict condition, one of the strictest in all the history of Canada. His life became another hell, draining the effort of his wife, Sophie Harkat, and their extended family. Today, he is still fighting some of these abusive and humiliating conditions. At the arrest of Mr. Harkat, at that time, Prime Minister of Canada was Mr. Jean Chrétien. Since, many other Prime Ministers arrived, Conservatives and Liberals, but both kept Mr. Harkat in limbo, with the threat of deportation to torture still hanging over his head. All these years, Mr. Harkat decided not to be bitter, but to build a life in his country, Canada. Like any other residents, he tried so hard to find a job, despite all the restrictions of not being able to use a computer, for instance, with an internet connection. Since 2 years, we have a new government that describes itself as progressive, liberal, feminist, and respecting human rights. Unfortunately for Mr. Harkat, that didn't make a big difference. His life is still in shatters, not being able to be treated fairly, always frightened and scared by the real possibilities of Canadian Border Service agents coming to his door in the middle of the night and sending him back in a plane to Algeria, where the threats of torture are real and documented by many human rights organizations. Today, as a human rights activist, as a citizen of Canada, as someone who lived through a family experience, through the anguish to know what will happen next, I call on the Prime Minister of Canada, Mr. Justin Trudeau, and his Refugees and Immigration Minister, Mr. Ahmed Hussein, and the Public Safety Minister, Mr. Rav Goodale, to put an end to this horrible ordeal lived by Mohamed Harkat and his family, and to allow him to stay in Canada and to rebuild his life in all serenity. Merci. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to answer them.
Okay. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you all for coming.